How do we implement access control using the access control matrix? This is what we want to discuss. So first of all, the access control matrix is going to be pretty large. There could be tons of resources depending on what kind of system you have. It's a large shared server. There could be lots of users. So it's a large matrix, but we know that the matrix is going to be fairly sparse. So sparse matrix here really means that many of the entries in the matrix are going to be null because most users not going to have access for a given resource. Resource is owned by somebody, he or she is going to have access to it, and maybe they choose to share it with a few other people. So the question is, how should we represent this matrix in the system? Actually, sparse matrix is represented in one of two ways. You can represent them either sort of a column measure or row measure, and that's something we can do here in this case. So we can sort of focus on each column of the matrix, and if most of the entries are null, we can just sort of ignore those, and we can sort of make a list that says, well, for object OI, user UI1, this user's access rights are this value. Okay, so this is sort of, we have these entries. So when I said, matrices, when they're sparse, they can be implemented through linked list, for example. So this could be a list of, and it's going to have a small number of entries because most users don't have any access for object OI. So if a given user has access, what kind of access we can have sort of this pair, the user ID and access rights, that makes up the first node in our list. The next user is going to be UI2, who has some other set of rights and so on. So we can just sort of go down the column and see what users actually have non-null access rights and sort of build these entries that become nodes in a linked list or something like that. So we can organize this information either by a resource or an object. Here, we'll have to keep track of what users have access to this object and what kind of access they have for this object. So that's one way to do it. When you do that, this list I'm talking about, or the data structure that we're talking about, which is this collection, is linked list kind of a data structure. That's a collection of these entries, what user has what access rights. This is called an access control list or an ACL. So if you sort of focus on a resource or object OI and grab the information who has access to this resource and what kind of access, that defines an access control list or ACL. To keep in mind is that ACLs are for resources we have in the system. So ACL is always associated with an object or a resource. There's another way to sort of think about how we can implement it. And rather than sort of focusing on columns, we can focus on rows. And we know that rows correspond to users. So we can go down horizontally, across a row and say, so what would we see? If it's a sparse matrix, this user UI is not going to have access for most of the objects, but he or she will have access to some objects. So the first object we run into for which UI has access is this object OI1. So the list we're going to generate here is going to say for this given user UI, we do have access, and these are the access rights for object OI1. The next object for which we have access, or this user UI has access, is OI2, and those access rights are defined by rights 2, and so on. So basically, we are ignoring the null entries in the row, and the entries that are not null are for certain objects. So these are those objects, and what kind of access for each of those objects, that's what we capture in this list. Well, this kind of a list is called a capability list. In some sense, what a user is capable of. A user is capable of accessing OI1 in this manner, OI2 in that manner. So it's called a capability list that is for a given user UI. Remember, ACLs are for an object. Capability lists are for a user. Again, CList is going to be associated with each user we have in the system. Remember, we have a row in the access control matrix for each user, and each row really is a CList. It's a list representation of what's in that row. So CLists are for users, ACLs are for objects.